Okay, so I've talked to you a couple of times already about how archaeologists are people. And so people sometimes have their own biases, they bring their own ideas, their own prejudices to the table. And to any interpretation may be colored by our way of thinking. And we looked at some of the methods that we use to try and reflect upon that and to filter out our own biases and actually just try to, as objectively as possible, represent the past. Some post-processualists would say that that's not possible, and that that we should build our interpretations with an acknowledgement of our bias, so we aren't fooled by our attempts to try and eliminate that. I'll let you think about that a little bit, but the reason why I'm bringing this back up is because what we're going to talk about today is North and Central American archaeology. And in the early days of archaeology, this was an extremely important place and time. North America prehistory was pretty crucial and central to the way archaeologists were trying to do their work. But they were bringing with them the biases of racism, colonialism, and inability to accept that native people could do the accomplishments that they encountered. And so, believe it or not, Thomas Jefferson himself was an early archaeologist. And he put to the test some of these very racist and colonialist ideas about the mound, so-called mound builders. And there are these series of mounds, especially in the eastern United States, that are impressive. They're impressive earthworks, and they were mysterious. And the colonizers who came across from Europe it was impossible for them to imagine that a Native American group would have been so sophisticated to have been able to produce these. So they turned to other ideas. They turned to biblical ideas, thinking that these were the Israelites, or they were the giants of the Old Testament, or there was a lost race of people that must have been white. Of course, they must have been white Europeans that came across somehow, because surely the indigenous people weren't capable of this. You can see how this is spiraling into some pretty racist ideas. But this is what some of the ideas in the 18th and early 19th century were about Native American archaeological sites. And to Thomas Jefferson's credit, he excavated a mound and said, nope, this is almost certainly Native Americans who did this. The indigenous people built the mound that he investigated. So he actually did an okay job for his time. It wasn't a very systematic excavation, but he actually tested it out and found it to be likely Native Americans who did this. So refuting some of these more outlandish claims. And of course, this we still get people today that talk about pseudo-archaeological ideas, trying to come up with fantastic claims about things that they don't understand very much about. It's very easy for a tourist to go to the Ohio River Valley and look at the 10,000 mounds that you see there, and talk about the mysterious mound builders and where they must be They must have been extremely advanced to do this. And so surely this can't be any Native American group that we know of today. This is based on ignorance, it's based on speculation, and it's still based on racism. So with that preface, what do we know about some of these accomplishments, some of these huge earthworks that we find, and when the colonizers came in from Europe, they saw the remains, the archaeological remains of once quite successful groups. It's a fact that when in 1492 and after that, the European colonizers were coming onto a continent or continents that actually were kind of in turmoil. Europeans brought with them diseases, but there was already pre-existing strife and conflict amongst groups, and some of them took that advantage of the colonizers to establish their role, and so and to get ahead and maybe defeat their enemies. So the people living in North America were people too. And they had their own biases and prejudices and enemies and friends. And the Europeans wedged in there and split apart many of these groups, making a way for them to enter. The rest is history, literally. And I don't want to focus on the colonial period, but I want to talk about pre-colonial North America. And one of these big turning points that we see, one of the first of those, we're going to come back to urbanization and when we get to those chapters later on. But last time we saw North America, we were talking about humans coming across through Beringia and possibly along the coast down to South America and in the interior into the rest of the continents. And that's where we left them. Now, these were hunters and gatherers. That was the survival strategy that they had. And we looked at that a little bit before. But how did we get from that to the mound builders, these huge earthworks that we find? How did we get from simple, small bands of hunters and gatherers following megafauna across the landscape or across the seascape and finding a new home in the new world? Well, and then of course the endpoint of these more complex societies, larger scale. Well, once again, we're going to talk about domestication, plant domestication in particular. So the introduction of agriculture was independently came about in North America. And of course, there are some main crops that we see today. So you can talk to Southwest communities right here in Nevada, and corn or maize is an extremely important part of society. But that is a domesticated plant species. There is no, you can't find prior to a certain date, what we know of as maize or corn is not a wild species. It's something whose qualities have been inflated and enhanced through generations of breeding these characteristics. And we looked at some of the theoretical concerns about how that took place in the Middle East with wheat and barley and some other plants. The same sort of process took place, but with indigenous plants to North America. And that was, one of those is a wild grass that's found in the Mexican highlands that has been studied for its genetic signature, and it has a relationship to maize. And it's considered to be, this is called teosinte, and it is considered to be the wild precursor to what we now know as modern maize or corn. There's evidence from instance, the Tehuacan Valley in Mexico, in northern Mexico, the highlands, that there's from dry caves, there's maize, squash, and bean samples. Now, the culture that we find these early examples of maize, squash, and beans was hunter-gatherers. And so it seems like there was hunter-gatherer societies that were already beginning to practice the process of domestication. Now, this is a little bit different from what we saw in the Middle East, where we saw sedentism starting to take hold first in some instances, although there's no one-size-fits-all for this process. This appears to be mobile groups that were already starting to select characteristics to breed into these plants. And so it was a gradual incorporation of domesticated plants into their diets. And the problem with that we had in the past of being able to really pinpoint when this takes place is because this is an issue with the concept of how you date things in general. That, let's say I find a burned out building and I find some wooden beams that are charred there, and I take a sample of it, I take it to a lab, and they give me a radiocarbon date for that wood. Now, that wood does not date when the building was built. It does not date when the building burned down. It only dates when the tree was cut and when it died. That's the way the carbon-14 process works and how we do the dating. It's when the living thing died. So if you have a 500-year-old building that reused a beam from an earlier 500-year-old building, and that building burned down 50 years ago, what exactly are you dating? You're not dating the building, you're not dating the destruction event of that. You're only dating when the tree was originally cut down, maybe for another purpose, for another building. And so this is where indirect dates, things like charcoal, and the association with stratigraphy hasn't always been a very good indicator of when the first plant remains we find them. But new technology, in particular AMS, or accelerator mass spectrometry, radiocarbon dating method, allows us to take very, very small samples. And this allows us to actually date the seeds themselves. So if we find a seed, a charred archaeobotanical sample, the seed itself, and we say that seed is a domesticated maize seed that's charred and preserved, let's put it into the AMS dating method, put it through that, and it will give us a direct date of that domesticated seed, so domesticated plant. So that method has allowed us to interrogate these dates a little bit better, and they often have produced younger dates than we were anticipating. Squash in Mesoamerica also, it has an ancestor in pumpkins. The Cucurbita pepo is a type of squash that's probably the wild precursor to pumpkins. Acorn squash, zucchini, spaghetti squash, all found in North America. You don't find these type of foods anywhere else in the old world. So you won't get squash, pumpkins, either any of these things in Mesopotamia, because the wild precursor was never domesticated. There was no wild precursor, so it was never domesticated there. This is exclusive to the North America. It's not until colonization took place that you started to get these things exchanged in different places back to the old world. So this, it seems like squash was actually the earliest of domesticated plant species in the New World. Gila Nakit's site in Mexico, it dates to between 10,000 and 8,300 years ago. So that would be between 8,000 and 6,300 BC. These are squash seeds that are bigger in size with a thicker rind, they are shifting in color, and so it seems as though these are becoming domesticated at that time, and that seems to be the earliest example of plant domestication. Also from the same site, we see from slightly later the earliest maize coming from there from about 50 years ago, and it is this teosinte that's having larger grains and a tougher rachis. We saw this sort of process taking place in Mesopotamia with wheat and barley. The same thing is happening with teosinte, and it's becoming maize. So they're selecting qualities that they prefer, and it makes this plant then dependent upon humans for survival and allows us to harvest it when we like and do with it what we like. And then slightly later, from about 5,500 years ago, we have from the Tehuacan Valley, bigger cobs, more rows of grains and kernels, and looking more and more like what we know today of as maize. And beans seem to have a couple of locations, Mesoamerica and the Andes Mountains, that we'll look at another time in South America. And the earliest date for beans is about 2,500 years ago. So domesticated maize seems to have first appeared in the highlands of Mexico by around 6,500 years ago. And you see it spreading from there. So this does seem to be an invention that took place in the highlands of Mexico and spread throughout both continents, really, eventually. At first going to northern Mexico and the southwest by about 3,400 years ago, and this is the period that we call the late Archaic period. And it brought with it many of the social changes that we saw in elsewhere, but of course, according to these local characteristics. So these were local cultures adopting local forms of agriculture, and it was changing them in a local way. This is not cultures being influenced from the old world and affecting the indigenous communities. So you have the site of Cerro Guanacana site, which has some late archaic arrowheads in it. But it also has terrace walls, probably for things like for cultivation. There are rock rings of unknown function, possibly ritual of some sort. You have wild plants and animals, but you also have grinding stones in some quantities present. So this was a site that was adopting some late archaic practices, and the site of Hornado Mogollon, about 100 kilometers from the one from Cerro Guanacana, did not have any significant agriculture until about 2,000 years later. So you can see that it was patchy. The spread of domestication had its home in the highlands of Mexico, and it started to spread to different communities, but not everyone adopted it. So this wasn't inevitable, it wasn't universal, and there are some theories as to why it was not adopted by everyone, and one of them is that maybe they had it pretty good already, and this is the optimal foraging theory, that humans were making rational decisions about their food resources to maximize efficiency of the local ecology. And so if you have a very productive landscape, you may not need to adopt intensive practices that are limiting your range of food, and it may not be very good returns to use domesticated plant species. So I'll let you read a little bit more about this optimal foraging theory on your own. but it's important to understand that it was not a universal adoption. It was sort of case by case. Each community was becoming influenced by this, and sometimes in marginal communities, even though it may not have been in their best interests in the long run, adopting maize agriculture was something that they did to secure their place, to have at least a yield. Then they weren't so dependent upon what the resources in that landscape were. But in more resource-rich areas, they may not have needed to switch. So you start to see with maize agriculture, once it is adopted, if it is adopted by a community, you have larger settlements. So you have this has probably a couple of reasons. One, having more family members, having more offspring. I hate to say it, means your kids are working in the field for you. So you're actually producing a labor force by growing bigger families. You also are able to secure your land. You have a more powerful security. But it also is possible to have larger families because you're producing more than you can possibly eat in by yourself. So you're creating storage, but who has the keys to those storerooms? Who are the ones who is in charge of it? Can you just go in and grab what you eat whenever you like? Or are there rules about that? So you start to see larger settlements. You start to see things like at Milagro. Another late archaic site has pit houses, but bell-shaped pits for storing maize, but also wild plants and animals. So you have a mixed economy there. Tuamaca, another late archaic site, also has terrace walls like we saw before. And at Las Capas, you have canals for irrigation of fields to actually produce better yields from your crop, but that also requires labor. And who's going to tell you to do this? You've got to organize that somehow. And if you're working on the canals, who's growing the crops and who's defending the crops? So you can see you're starting to have division of labor, and this leads to more structured and hierarchical societies. That's going to be important later on when we start moving into the urban revolution. So there's also some very good evidence from the Mogollon Highlands and the Colorado Plateau for this sort of movement into larger settlements. But in this region, it wasn't really large villages. They used caves instead. And there's very good preservation in these caves because it's very arid, very dry, and you have good preservation of things like basketry and nets. And burials, even with things like clothing and